Great, thanks, David. Okay, we're going to get started, and we have a good group here, and then we have others joining us via Zoom. My name is Mark Kissler. I'm a general internal medicine doc here on the Anschutz campus, also involved with the Center for Bioethics and Humanities in various capacities, and have the pleasure today of talking to Susan Okie. Before we get started, I wanted to point out, so we have an open call for submissions for our annual online anthology of poetry, prose, visual arts, photography, music, and videos, which is called The Human Touch. And so Malia will put a link in the chat for this. But starting on November 20th, all the way through the end of January, we're accepting submissions for this journal. It's really great, high quality literary journal here. And you don't have to be affiliated with the Anschutz Medical Campus to submit. So anyone who's engaged in a creative practice and wants to get your work out there, this is an excellent opportunity. Right. So I have the pleasure of introducing Susan. Susan Okie is a doctor, a poet, a former Washington Post medical reporter. She spent 2 decades writing about science and medicine for that newspaper and served as a time for the Post's science editor. During her family's 3 years living in Kenya, she filed science and medicine stories from Africa for the Post's foreign desk. She also worked for several years as a contributing editor of the New England Journal of Medicine. At about age 50, a poetry workshop rekindled Susan's enjoyment of writing poetry. She went on to earn an MFA in poetry for the program for writers at Warren Wilson College in 2014. Her poems have appeared in the Prairie Schooner, the Gettysburg Review, the Bellevue Literary Review, JAMA, and other journals. Her first full-length poetry collection, Woman at the Crossing, which you can see here, was chosen by Garrett Hongo as winner of the 2023 Off the Grid Poetry Prize and was published in October by Grid Books. She's the author of 2 nonfiction books, Fed Up, Winning the War Against Childhood Obesity, and To Space and Back, a children's book co-written with astronaut Sally Ride. Susan was trained in family medicine and after leaving journalism, volunteered for many years in a safety net clinic for uninsured adults living in Maryland's Montgomery County. As adjunct faculty member at Georgetown University School of Medicine, she taught patient interviewing and clinical ethics to first and second year medical students. And we're really thrilled to have you. I've been enjoying your book very much and spending some time in it over the last couple of weeks since we spoke. So we're excited to hear. We're going to do kind of a traditional poetry reading where we hear some poems. We'll have a little dialogue and then we'll open it up for questions, both from those in the room and in Zoom. And we're joined by a great group on the campus here, including some medical school alumni, it sounds like, who shared with Dr. Okie, her husband and her son. So great. Well, thank you so much. Would you like to get us started?
I would love to. Yeah, thank you for having me. First poem is about an experience in medical school, which I'm sure will be somewhat familiar to other people who've been anatomy. I wrote this poem, pretty much finished it while I was doing the MFA. Older than some of the ones you'll hear, but told by teachers that I had that this was a way of kind of expressing how hard you have to look at things. Anatomy lab. That night I unwrapped only her right hand and sat probing to free the lovely network of cables in her. Some impulse made her give her body. I didn't know her name or one thing about her life. I tugged on the flexor digitorum tendons, her fingers partly closed and her thumb crooked in. Two of us as if from outside, and could no longer name the tendons. I felt my fingers from inside her hand. Soon I would open the gates of her ribs, would hold even her heart in my palm. Afterward, always home, to feel your palms circling on the small of my back. Another one, this one is a more sort of an upbeat, I think it's an upbeat poem, even though it does contain a loss. And my husband and I and our family spend time at a beach on Island. And that's where the poems that reference the beach, the ocean in this book pretty much take place. Black dog wakes us with fish breath. She found a ripe one in the muck on her first dash. She reeks of it. Drunk on the smell, she sneaks out, runs full tilt up and down the wet lawn. Over my feet, over my head, 2 Kennedy geese pass, honking, creaking. Wind's picked up, but can't drown the roar of waves from the barrier beach. Surf will reach 6 feet tonight. Down by the channel, birdsong carries. I can hear willets piping on their nests in the marsh on the far side. My teacher died last week. He told us, come to the page with a full heart and an empty mind. He walked the paths where Keats walked in Hampshire when the poet wrote his great ode to the dying season. Hoped to work at his desk till fall, revise as he watched the leaves turn, recalling elms, crowns of airy dreams. But it's April, the leaves still in bud, everything swelling, opening. Here pine a mockingbird carols, a flock of peeps skims the water looking to land on the oyster bar. A dead fish is cause for rejoicing. I will read one more. One is our family. I should explain. Our family spent 3 years in Kenya, where my husband who was with the Navy, was in a malaria program and was working on research related to finding malaria vaccines or better treatments. And it was a life-changing time for us, but this was another kind of life change that I wasn't expecting. And it happened right as soon as we got there. The rains begin in Western Kenya, 1991. All through the dry season, I swallow my tears. I don't sleep, eat without tasting, wander the house without seeing my children. Across the Atlantic, my mother has died. Tunes from the Requiem of Mozart sing day and night in my brain. Morning, the air tastes different. A wind rustles, ignites scarlet blossoms on the flame tree, as if to burn the branches to ash. Giant toads appear like stones, stick out their tongues at the sky. Night, thunder, waterfall of rain. Lake, flying ants rise into the sky over marshes, villages, drop into the mouths of toads, dogs, children, fill everything that is empty.
Thank you. Let's pause for a minute. We can talk some and then we'll continue. I'm curious to hear about this discovery or rediscovery of poetry in your 50s. What prompted you to begin this creative practice and to go as deeply as you did? And then the second part of that is how your writing and your medical practice might inform one another, kind of both ways.
Okay. I think I felt like I always needed to write, but I had most of the writing that I did early on while in college and then starting in medical school was journalism of a sort. I did some travel journalism when I was in college, and then I ended up with 2 summers at the Washington Post, because back in the day at Harvard Medical School, we got the summer off for the first couple of years. I was an intern writing, doing medical reporting with some science post. And I sort of established this relationship with them, and they kept saying, oh, come back anytime, we'll hire you, So that was comforting to know. And then I did go back to the Post. It was a long story how it all happened. I got partway through residency, got depressed and burned out. And we moved to Washington, Walter and I. And I, was a medical reporter for the Post 3 years then, and then returned again later after finishing residency. So for years, I was writing basically to explain science to people, to make it very clear, to report on changes in medicine, the epidemic became a big story. Smoking, the fight against smoking became a big story. And at a certain point after 20 years of reporting, I started thinking, well, this job is all about making things clear to people and not giving your own opinion and not injecting your emotions. But I feel like I want to write more about how I feel. And I never can do that as a reporter. And so I took a workshop from Stanley Plumley, who was the poet that died in that poem you heard. And he was a wonderful teacher and wanted to do that. So that was what kept me, ignited by poetry and wanting to go get the MA.
There's both in that anatomy poem and in the others that you read, there's such an attention to detail and a noticing that happens that strikes me is also a skill that a skilled clinician will bring to those patient encounters as well. Is that something that you talked about in your writing process? That's something you think about, that commerce between doctoring and writing?
Well, I wrote about things that happened in medical school and in medicine, once I started writing poetry, because I had strong memories of training wrong or interactions with patients. And when I was at Warren Wilson, I was constantly told that one sort of signature of these poems was looking hard at things, trying to look at what happened, trying to understand what the experience was about. And I think that's a lot of what writing programs for doctors do too. They talk a lot about understanding the patient experience, trying to experience more clearly what your patients do, and about just understanding when something goes wrong or when something disturbing, bad happens, being able to sort of share that with colleagues too, or share it with yourself by writing about what happened.
Do you have a few more for us?
Sure. So, okay, this one is about a patient I was very fond of. He's a patient from the safety net clinic where I was volunteering. And some of the poems in this book are sort of, they have a heading called A Doctor's Eye because it's trying to sort of show some emphasis. Doctor's Eye, Ignacio's foot. I know this foot, the sturdy stump that ends mid-instep in a calloused knob, the horny yellow skin slammed with each step against the sole of your salted working boot. I remember toes turning dusky like summer plums, the innocent wound launching bacteria to melt your flesh. On your x-rays, infection's shadow crept up the bones till I sent you by taxi to the hospital, where a surgeon lopped off the darkened, rotting half. Mornings, since your daughter took you in, you limp beside your grandson to the bus, clean the house, scrape together dollars to pay your fare. Today, you greet me with a toothless smile and show your numbers, high water marks of sugar in the blood. Tenderly, you unswaddle the stump, present it for my inspection. Look, perfecto. Next time you see me here, I will walk in with a woman on my arm. Next one is really it's a poem about an event that was traumatic for me and fatal for the patient. It's a sudden event that happened when I was a resident, and it's called Thy Bed of Crimson Joy. Yellow skin, belly taut and round, a lemon of a man. Doctor, he'd call, I need a beer. We found a few one time under his bed. His mother sneaked them in, although she knew beer had done in his liver. Beer would kill him. Doctor! One day I heard a different note, found him struggling to sit up while dark blood gushed from his throat. For me, eyes wide as a child's. I shouted, ran for help, but all refused to come. Nothing to save. I returned alone to find his breathing stilled, a lemon on a crimson bed. I guess I read this poem because it was haunting, it was terrible, and I felt so shocked when the nurses at the nurses station said, well, you know, we can't do anything, we're not coming. It just seemed wrong that, you know, nobody was going to be there. And when I ran back to be there, he was gone. He was gone. So I'll never forget that. You know, it just feel like it would have been better just to stay in the room, no matter how scary it was that he was bleeding out. But I think we all, as physicians, have really difficult experiences sometimes, and it's therapeutic to write about these things, even if you never share them with anybody. I think it helps process the emotions.
Yeah, it strikes me that in both of those, so often the protagonist of these stories that medicine tells about itself is the clinician or the science, and there's this shift in the role of the seeing, and the role of this clinical gaze as one of witnessing, and that's a really profound shift in who the protagonist is in both of these. Thank you.
I'm going to read another Kenya poem at this point. We were there for 3 years, as I said, and we lived in Kisumu, Kenya, which is a small city, pretty small, but it's not tiny, on Lake Victoria. So the lake, this huge lake, part of the experience of being there, it had bows in it, it had, you know, all sorts of things. And my husband was doing malaria research, and I was doing articles for the Post where I saw possibilities about science and about climate and environmental change and whatever occurred to me while we were there. And there was a lot to think about writing about. So this is called On Lake Victoria, 1992, for Peter Ochumba. I meant to add that AIDS was in really full flare there, and they didn't have drugs either to treat the infection, treat AIDS, or to treat the infection along with AIDS. Above rare fish with gaping mouths, we float, motor dead. The lake's warm as soup, noonlight blinking off your glasses as you pull the starter cord. Your goal to save the strange species that live only here. Between us, one water bottle, little fuel, no shade, no paddle, miles from shore, the villages with rough-sawn fishing boats, young men asleep in huts, their flesh melting from AIDS. This lake a highway for fishermen, smugglers, viruses. You in your frayed hat, a scientist who lacks sample jars, aquarium, your limbs bony too, pretending the weekend funerals have nothing to do with you. Shadow of a huge perch slips beneath the boat. The motor coughs, starts. I'm skipping around a bit from these different times. I think of this poem as a little bit of a feminist poem, but it's really about an animal. It's back to Chincoteague again. It's called The Filly. I should mention that Chincoteague has a famous pony auction every summer. They have wild ponies on the island that is across the channel from the town. And the fire department is in charge of the ponies, and they herd them into town, and then they sell off the extra colts and foals because they have to keep the herd to a certain size. The filly, not one of those who splay their feet and sink to the ground trying to get away. She stands strong, slender legs under her, head erect on a long neck, looking at the crowd with a questioning eye. Palomino with ragged spots of cream, shining in cloud-filtered light, owning her body. Forward in small, smooth steps into the arena as if two strong men were not gripping her by the chest and haunches. Into the center they urge her, pivot her to face the faces, while another looks for bidders, shouts at a raised hand. The price climbs fast. She's tall, golden, all consents her spirit. She can't know that beauty, heart, even that pale coat have marked her to become a broodmare on the refuge. Tomorrow, when other foals are loaded into trailers to learn about the bit for some child's pleasure, she'll wade into the channel with the wild herd, swim back to the ocean with her mother. Will I keep going on the motherhood front here?
Sure. Yeah, that's great.
Okay. I have quite a few poems about motherhood in this book. I'm not going to read them all, but the one that I'm going to read is one that I'm fond of. Two mothers. This is set back in Washington, back at work in Washington. Two mothers. Hannah comes in like the sun, gathers up my 3-year-old who laughs to feel her hug. She doesn't grab the baby, Jacob, waits to see where she'll fit in the network of our needs. Maternity leave's over. I want her as my mother. Of her life, I only hear the outline. She fled Cameroon, husband's always working. His mother in Virginia tends their child while Hannah cares for mine. That feels wrong. Not to worry, she tells me. In their culture, it's grandma's job. Jacob cries. She wraps him in a shawl on her back to ride while she does dishes. Evenings, my breasts aching, I hurry home to nurse, but she can never let him cry when he wants a bottle. My milk dries up, unneeded. Walking one summer morning, Jacob at 2 holds my hand on the lane beside our house. I'm chatting with another mom when he spots Hannah coming. He lets go, runs ahead to greet her. Oh, wonderful, my neighbor murmurs. That's what you want.
Thank you. Just listening to these and having read through, there's, in addition to the close noticing and that really close reading of these situations, there's so many poems of really intense interpersonal relationship in this dyad between you and your father, or between you and these other figures that and I think it's so evocative. It reminds me a bit of, again, that clinical, the one-on-one moment but it seems to overflow that in these beautiful ways.
Thank you. Both when we were in Washington and in Kenya, we had help. I had somebody helping us with the kids, and there was a person, Franyi, who was our nanny in Kenya, and I feel like these become very strong friendships and relationships. You're basically sharing parenthood with somebody. And I think that, the years in Kenya were really life-changing for all of us. It was culture, it was sad at times because there were all these health problems within the country. But it was a very moving time. I have one, you told me that you particularly like this one, and this is about my favorite poet, Elizabeth Bishop. So do this one. Elizabeth Bishop injects herself with adrenaline for asthma. That Elizabeth Bishop did have terrible allergies from childhood onward, and she did have really bad asthma. And she lived in Brazil for a period, the partner, and her doctor back in New England used to send her the drugs for the asthma. So Elizabeth Bishop injects herself with adrenaline for asthma. A fine needle in the arm opens your chest, raises you to a high pitch, sets you humming all night. Saved from drowning, you float on the surface, gulping breaths, heart at a scarlatti gallop. And how the lines come in a fine tremble as your fingers grip the pen to to make illegible stitches on the moon white. Lend me your waterfall. I want to watch the fireflies floating up the wooded ridge at Samambaya, to hear your gardener, Manuelino, singing to his donkey. Let me dive with the riverman to the place where Luandina, the serpent goddess, will blow her cigar smoke into my mouth.
Should we open it up for some questions from the audience?
That would be a
So
good thing.
for those of you in the room, please push and hold the button in front of you so that our Zoom participants can hear and speak into the microphone. And then Malia is going to help us out with questions via the chat as well.
Does that work? Yeah, Susan, that was great. I shouldn't be talking so you can keep reading. But I'm interested, this is, our moderator said you've got this incredible eye for detail, but you didn't start writing these poems until your 50s?
No, I didn't. I wrote poems when I was a teenager, college, and then I really didn't write poems for a long time.
So I'm just wondering how you nurtured the memories. They go back to Anatomy Lab or Kenya. That was, at least a decade, maybe more.
Anatomy Lab left a pretty strong imprint on my brain. Wasn't too hard to remember that. And there are other experiences in medicine, like Ignacio's foot, people who stay with you that you want. I don't know. I read recently an article about Rilke, who's a famous poet, and it was fascinating. The author was saying that Rilke didn't write about people. He didn't really have relationships with people. Kind of got a lot of free stays in castles, but he always write about things and tigers and things like that. Always things. But people kind of stay in my memory. I think it's sort of natural for me to nurture these memories of people. Often I do write about people.
Yes.
For being here. This is fabulous. I'm very curious to hear about your MFA journey, why you chose to pursue it while you were in the midst of your medical career. How did that go? If you could just kind of speak to that whole process.
Okay, well, my medical career was very interrupted, because I started the residency, then I went to the back and finished residency, thought about becoming a family practitioner. But at that point was when Walter decided to leave primary care, my husband Walter, and get into malaria research. So he joined that, and it made sense for us to go back to Washington, train there and work on the malaria program, and I could return to the post. So I ended up back there doing science. And as I said, there came a point in my life when I started wanting to write more personal feelings down, not just be explaining. I felt like that was an important, good thing to be doing. And Warren Wilson it was the first, I think, of the low residency MFA. Everybody there really was there because they wanted so much to be writing. And it was wonderful. You go there for a couple weeks, twice a year, working individually with poets or writers who are your mentors. But to read, for me, it was just like getting to go back to college and being an English major. Plus, I was working with these wonderful writers, and they would send feedback letters, which were pages long, on stuff that I had written or things that I. So it was just kind of like a luxury, to be able to that part of my personality, which had been way like in a cupboard for a while in order to do reporting for the Post and
Let's check in. Malia, do we have any on the chat? Okay, great.
You mentioned Elizabeth Bishop and your mentor, Stanley Plumley. Yeah. Who are some other poets who influenced you? Did you read poetry throughout those years? You weren't writing it?
I know, I don't think I did. I was having to read a lot of things for my job, and I read a lot of fiction. I always have. I love novels. If I could write novels, I would, but I'm not very good at making things up. But I guess I would say the poets that I met at Warren Wilson or Marion Morris Manning, those are poets who taught me and have influenced me a lot. Glick, who died recently, I think is a master. I really like Adam Zajewski, who is another poet who died recently. There are some published poets and Eastern European poets whose work, particularly writing about World War II and what happened in their countries and in their cities, I find very, very moving. What else do I read? I mean, I have a whole bookshelf full of poets. I like Carl Phillips's work very much. Those are the people that come to mind just off the top of my head. Actually, reading poetry first thing in the morning is the best way to start getting your brain ready to write, I think, or to have ideas on your own. I've been encouraged to do that when I first wake up. And it's a good day if I actually wake up with a line in my head, because then sometimes that's the start of it. Happen very often.
I really love the poem that takes place on Lake Victoria and how you're having a conversation with your interlocutor using you over and over again. You do this, you know this, you see this. And it has a way of bringing, it could be about this one person, but it could be about any person. And it has a way of bringing listeners into your interactions in this way that makes us feel like we're there in the conversation with you. And I wondered about your use of, maybe this is too geeky, pronouns, but also how you attempt to bring your listeners into a poem, what ways you do this, maybe in other poems, or if you think a lot about pronouns like I do.
I do. That's a really good question. It's very natural for me to start out using the you when I'm writing a poem, say to my father, of which there are quite a few in this book. You know, they're sort of addressing the person as if they were there, even if they're not there, and trying to remember what it was like when we went on this trip together or when we had this conversation. And I've been encouraged by teachers sort of always question yourself, why did I choose to put it in the second person? And maybe write it over, not in the second person, write it in a different way, you know, more he and she, or third, just to see what the impact is on the effect of the poem. And sometimes it stays in the second person, and sometimes but I think one of the things that I've learned over the years most from all of the teachers I've had is revise, revise, revise. You know, and I think Elizabeth Bishop, who was friends with Robert Lowell when he died, she wrote a poem to him and she said something like, "Can't revise anymore." In the poem after he had died, you know, no more revisions, Robert, I'm sorry.
I love the detail and the human connection, but with each one of your poems, I found myself smiling and even laughing. And is that something that you do on purpose? Because we're talking about AIDS, we're talking about poverty, we're talking about so many, pretty serious issues, and yet I find myself smiling. And so, would you like to comment on why I feel that way?
I'm happy that you're feeling, more than one emotion, because poetry is working. I did a bunch of other doctors who write. There's a film called Why Doctors Write, which you can get online. It's a documentary. And I wasn't in any sort of program in medical school that offered a chance to have a write. But I think Mark, did a program where he studied narrative medicine, and I can see how the appeal would be really great of having a writing group of doctors and being at a place where you actually could share your work. But Robert Frost always says, no surprise for the writer, no surprise for the reader. That was have to discover something in the process of the writing of the poem. You might think you know what it's about, and you're just out the way I would write a news story. That way, you have to sort of let it happen, and don't have changes of mood or turns, as they're called. Then you have a poem that sort of is flat. And Stanley Plumley always used to say, no one else can have your experience, but you send it to them in a way where they almost do, involving the feelings of that experience and not just facts. You have to, you tell them. Or sort of, the more the poem varies a bit. Happy that you're laughing.
Yes.
This is a question from the chat. Do you find you have an equally strong drive to write about the present day as to write about significant experiences in the past?
I guess not really. I think percolate in my mind up from the past pretty often. If something happens in the present, I sometimes do write about it right away. Example would be, it's not in the book, but my son Jacob is here. He's a resident. I have a poem that I wrote not too long after he left home to move to medical school, it was. And he was sorting stuff in his room and packing, and he had to pack his car, and he had to bring objects, and it was a big deal. And I assumed that there would be a mess, a lot more stuff. But in fact, he sort of was heading out to the car, and then he looked at the room and he said, "Oh, I don't want to leave you with this mess." So he sort of got rid of a lot of extra stuff that I wasn't expecting him to go through. And I wrote a poem about that because it was this emotional I had to the fact that, wow, this is a really mature thing. Left town a lot of times before, and this has never happened before. This is a real landmark. So I wrote a poem about it, and that got published last year in a journal. Published in these journals, so it's a big. But that was something that happened in the moment, and that did turn.
Do you find that your memory of these, do you notice things differently after you've written about them than before? And I'm seeing a note that there's some audio breakup. Is that right? I may hand you this mic to use just so we get a little smoother. Oh, great. Okay. David, let me know when you have the lapel mic off. Do you find that you see things differently after you've written about them?
I don't know if I saw them. Well, yes, I do. And I guess some of the father poems are a good example of that, because writing about my father, I had a problematic close relationship, but he was sort of a mystery to me in a lot of ways. He was kind of secretive about a lot of things in his life or his feelings. And it is healing, I think, for me to write about some of my frustration at how he had these secrets. It ends up that you accept the person more as they are or were, the more you kind of get out your own reactions to it in the poetry. And eventually I think you can accept the relationship and the person as they were, that they gave you what they could, and the things they couldn't give you, they just couldn't give you because they'd been told never to talk about this ever, ever, ever. Which is sort of how it was with my father and his mother, I think. So that's an example. Yeah.
Might read one more there of the dictionary poem.
I'd be happy to. I have to find out what page it's on.
While we're doing that, we can scan for other questions. You have one when we're okay. Let's read first, and then we'll ask this next one, William.
When I talked to my brother recently, who I'm going to be visiting, he said, he said, I don't remember our father ever telling me to do this. He must have thought I was just never a loser. But you'll see what I mean when I read this. The dictionary: profluvium, a flowing out, massive mustard colored, too heavy for a child to lift. All my life it's lived on this wooden stand built to hold a big book. At dinner, if my father used a word I didn't know, he'd send me to the stand in my parents' bedroom, make me look it up. So thin the pages, yellowed now, so small the type, so difficult to spy the word hiding in a field of text. Herpetic, reptilian, raptor, an abandoned order consisting of the birds of prey as the hawks, eagles, vultures, owls. Once seized, I'd carry the definition back to the table. My father would say more about the word, how to use it. Minuet, a slow, graceful dance consisting of a coupé, a high step, and a balance. In my teens, I grew to resent the book and its rules, the order to stop eating, march down the hall to find a word. But my father was most present during those interruptions, eager to share a love of language. Heterodox, contrary to or different from some acknowledged standard. When he died, the book came to me. It waits on its stand under a window near my dining room. Redound, to rise or surge as water.
You'd evoke the narrative medicine kind of way of thinking about this interplay between art and medicine, writing and medicine, and this question about what makes us smile or what makes that satisfactory feeling. I feel this sense of affiliation, a kind of a deep affiliation, even in the midst of what sounds like was a complicated, relationship. And I think there's so many of these moments of in this attention to detail, this representation, and these are kind of the key tenets of that movement, that attention and representation spiral towards these moments of affiliation. That's kind of a key concept within the narrative medicine world. I think these really evoke that feeling of affiliation in beautiful ways. Okay. So we have a few more minutes. We're doing great. Malia, you had one from the chat.
Does writing a poem ever scare you with its revelation?
Yes. I think part of what's scary sometimes is some of the things that I write about are painful memories. And it's frightening to be that visible. You know, you really make yourself pretty visible when you write about some of those things. But at the same time, sometimes people really give me a gift with their response to the poem or the fact that it helped them in some way. So I think it's worth it. And I was fascinated in watching that movie and listening to these different doctors at different centers that have writing programs, as like the one that you were in, about how they thought that writing about difficult patient experiences, for example, made them understand better what was going on, made them remember the conversation better, made them better listeners, made them better therapists. And there was something that an anesthesiologist said that I had never thought of before. She said, well, I find that writing poems helps me hone my choice of words. And when you have to explain surgery or a procedure or an illness to someone, the choice of the words you use as a doctor is really important. And that is something that I get from writing. So I hadn't thought of it that way, but you know, it's a way in which the writing can actually improve the care if you think of it that way.
Would you say a few words about your writing process? What it looks like when you set out to write?
Well, poems take more than a day. You know, like I said, you have to revise, you have to revisit. I find it very helpful to be in poetry groups. I have lots of close friends in poetry at this point, and you get to know people really well, obviously, from listening to their poems over the years. And you get a lot of support, and even friends from Warren Wilson. You know, it's a very close-knit bunch of people because we're all so engaged in writing. So my first draft is never my best draft, and because I have this background as a reporter, I have a tendency to sort of tell the facts too much, and sometimes I have to get rid of that in the poem, not do it as much as I used to do at the Post. And then taking it to other people and sharing it with friends and getting suggestions, or having someone say, well, you know, it really doesn't work when you use that word there, or you shouldn't reveal this so soon, or you should, you know, start in the middle of the action more and leave out all of the, what we sometimes call the on-ramp, where you had to write a lot of words to get going. It helps you with the revision process to make the poem stronger, and listening to other people's work helps you learn new tricks and have new ideas for writing too. So I feel like it's solitary while you're writing, but then it's not solitary when you're sharing it in this way with other people that are trying to do the same thing.
Susan, I'm curious to know whether private writing, in other words, journaling, is part of your process, and is it different for you? If so, is it different for you when your interlocutor is yourself?
It is important for me. I don't do it every day, but for example, I do it a lot more when I'm down at the beach and I have more time and I'm in a more sort of contemplative mood. But sometimes I do use a journal just to remember what happened or what we did when we were spending those weeks down there, or to talk about travel if we're in a new place, you know, to write down my impressions about going to Mesa Verde or something like that. And those don't necessarily turn into poems. Sometimes they do, though. You know, talking about the West, I have a poem in here that's about Chaco Canyon. And that's a trip that we made, Walter and I made with our other son one time. And it's sort of a magical, spiritual place. And I wrote, you know, things in the journal when I was there, but I wrote the poem about it quite a bit later. So having a journal that has some of the details of what you saw is really valuable in that kind of instance when a poem gets started quite a while after the actual event.
Hey there. Good to see you, Mom. I was just curious. I mean, I've had the privilege of knowing and watching you on this sort of journey into poetry and through poetry. And like, I'd be curious to hear your perspective on if you think that writing poetry has changed you overall.
I think it's made me a better observer and a better introspector. You know, I think it has made me understand particularly the difficulties of some family relationships, you know, from the past. Probably made me more curious about other people too, because in writing about relationships, you think more deeply about them. I can't say how else it's changed me, but I know it's made me happier. I know it's made me a happier person and just sort of more comfortable in myself.
I wanted to be sure to ask, so John Gardner, the novelist and teacher of writing, said that when he would speak at university campuses, the most common question he would get is, do you write with a pencil or a typewriter? And he said that he thought that there was a deeper question than it seemed, and that what it was actually trying to get at was some of the magic behind the scenes, and that really at its deepest level, he said, what he thought these students were asking is, for the young writer, is there any hope? And so I'm curious what you might have to say to anyone in the audience, whether they're a young writer or not, who's at the beginning phases of their foray into expression, into their craft. What might you say to somebody like that?
I would say just keep going. And, you know, remember that it's never perfect the first time. I think I was always enchanted with my first drafts when I was starting out. It's like, wow, I wrote a poem. Look at that. It's a whole page. And be excited that there's something that I wrote down and, you know, maybe it makes sense. Maybe it works. But it was painful, but necessary to learn that you have to keep working on it if you really want it to become a stronger poem. And you do discover things. You do learn things in the process. I would say try not to do it in isolation. You know, it's so much more fun if you have people to share the poetry with, and you learn more quickly when something's not working. It's so important to get feedback from people who are also trying to do what you're doing, and who can say, well, this stanza in here, I don't understand what it's doing there. It's not contributing anything. Or that line kind of stops me. It confuses me because of the way you use that word and I can't understand it. It's really helpful to get this kind of feedback. And it's a great way to, you know, enlarge your circle of friends and the depth of your conversations with people. So I would say keep doing it, because it's really good for you, but it's better for you when you have colleagues and other people that you can share it with.
You have one more for us before we finish?
Sure.
I'll hold. You're doing a great job juggling the microphone here. That's not Sure.
Okay.
Any other questions before we get to our, Malia? I just want to make sure we're not missing anything. This has been really remarkable. I appreciate your time and to bring these poems and these words and this pace to our campus right in the midst of our clinical day, I think is such a gift for all of us. So thank you for that.
Thank you. I'm going to pull a surprise and do the Chaco Canyon poem instead of the one we were talking about, because I mentioned it. To the spirits of Chaco Canyon. And this one is a rhymey poem too. It has a form. I forget what the name of the form is, but it's written in form. So, to the spirits of Chaco Canyon. Puzzle of stone, we bow to pass the door. Within a hive, stone chambers multiply. Light trembles in a puddle on the floor. One room where golden eagles, tethered, stare. One where macaws yield feathers till they die. Puzzle of stone, we bow to pass the door. From canyon rims the monsoon rivers pour, but summer burns both wash and meadow dry. Light flashes in a puddle on the floor. In the first days, the mother's navel tore, birthed the first people under the sun's eye. Puzzle of stone, we bow to pass the door. Dance, dance below the seasons to restore. In shadowed rooms, I hear your children cry. Light beckons from a puddle on the floor. Empty the hive. No signal fires flare to greet the sun's ascent from rim to sky. Puzzle of stone, we bow to pass the door. Light trembles in a puddle on the floor.
Well, thank you so much. I know there's some books for sale here. We'll be around for a moment for other comments and questions. And thank you all for coming, for your time and your attention.
You all for
All right.
coming live.